entertainment to the point where they've even been able to string out a series of movies and make lots of money by trying to show the audience that at the very end of the movie it looks as though the superhero or superheroes are simply not going to make it and are not going to win and be victorious in the end. And what does that do? That provokes the audience to be very interested in the next movie so that they'll go and find out what's going to happen to this superhero or to these superheroes. What's going to be the end result? Is it really over? Is there really no hope? Is there really no way that they're going to be victorious? Truly, we see throughout Scripture several cases where it looks as though the faithful, it looks as though God's people are without hope, are in complete despair, and are not going to be victorious in what it is that God has promised them, or in regards to their safety concerning their life. We're going to look at several examples of this in just a few moments, and we're also going to contemplate and consider how we can execute in times of despair and in times of difficulty, knowing that if we just cleave to the Lord and remain faithful unto Him, all will be well in the end. Look with me beginning in Genesis chapter 37. Genesis chapter 37. And notice here what we find in this chapter. Beginning with me in verse 1. And Jacob dwelt in the land wherein his father was a stranger in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it his brethren, and they hated him yet the more. And he said unto them, Hear, I pray you, this dream which I have dreamed. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose, and also stood upright, and behold, your sheaves stood round about, and made obeisance to my sheep. And his brethren said to him, Shalt thou indeed reign over us? Or shalt thou indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. Verse 9, And he dreamed yet another dream, and told it his brethren, and said, Behold, I have dreamed a dream more. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. And he told it to his father and to his brethren. And his father rebuked him and said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee to the earth? And his brethren envied him, but his father observed the same. We notice here that what is taking place, and these dreams are not irrelevant. In the past, we understand that God had delivered His inspired word in various ways. The Hebrews writer explains this to us in Hebrews chapter 1, beginning there in verse 1. God, who at sundry times and in diverse manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by His Son, whom He hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also He made the worlds. And so today we now have the will of God provided to us in its completed form in the Scriptures, as Jesus had explained, as we went over even this morning in John chapter 16 and verse 13, that those in the first century would be guided into all truth. It's now been delivered. As Jude explains in verse 3, it's completed. We have it before us. But in the Old Testament time, sometimes I think we read through this chapter here and these accounts in Genesis chapter 37, we think, what's the big deal? Joseph dreamed a dream, and he's explaining it to his brothers, he's explaining it to his parents, and it seems as though they're taking and putting so much weight on this dream. Well, it was understood that oftentimes that is how God would have spoken to His creation. And so there's much contemplation being given to it. Even the Father, we notice here in verse 11, is observing the same. There is recognition by Israel, by Jacob, that, hey, there might be something going on here. Well, the brothers also are aware of this, and we understand that in the rest of this chapter, what takes place regarding Joseph and the envy and the concern that the brothers have regarding his dreams. We end up realizing that Joseph ends up in slavery. He ends up being in a situation where he was not going to be reigning over his brethren, not going to be reigning over his father. It seems to be taking a path and a diversion to what it was that he had initially dreamed. And we recognize that Joseph ends up being with Potiphar, ends up being tempted by Potiphar's wife. Notice with me here in Genesis chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39. Look with me here beginning in verse 7. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, Lie with me. But he refused, and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And it came to pass, as he spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie to her or to be with her. And so what is the path, what is the route that Joseph is taking? Is he choosing to be faithful unto the Lord here? Or is he choosing to divert and say, you know what, Lord, it seems as though this dream that I had isn't panning out the way it was delivered unto me. It seems as though things are becoming worse off. I'm now initially enslaved. Of course, I've been given this responsibility and this honor, but my brothers have abandoned me. They've sold me off. I'm away from my family. It seems as though I should just go ahead and take hold of my master's wife. She's presenting herself to me. She's certainly eager to engage me in this manner. So what's the big deal? I'll just become unfaithful to the Lord. He seems to have left me and become unfaithful unto me. But that's not the response that Joseph takes at all. He refuses her, but yet he still finds himself in even more trouble. Notice with me here in then verse 11 that it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. And she caught him by his garment, saying, Lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. He says, I'm wanting nothing to do with this. He flees, he gets away. Verse 13, and it came to pass, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house and spake unto them, saying, See, he hath brought in Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass when he heard that I had lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled and got him out. And she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home. And she spake unto him according to these words, saying, The Hebrew servant, which thou hast brought unto us, came in unto me to mock me. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out. And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, After this manner did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound. And he was there in the prison. And so once again, how is it turning out for Joseph? Ever since these dreams occurred, it seems as though nothing but trouble is coming upon Joseph. But we notice in verse 21, the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him mercy, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. And so Joseph once again accepted his lot. He didn't say, well, Lord, it looks like you've abandoned me again. It looks like these dreams aren't coming to pass. I might as well just give up and cease from being faithful. But instead says, hey, here are the cards that I've dealt. Here's what it is that I have before me. How is it that I can remain faithful to the Lord and do my very best? And by doing so, he is then a pleasing servant unto those that are over him. And by doing so, those that are over him and those that are involved in the work of Joseph are indeed prospering because of his faithfulness. We then recognize that more opportunities come before Joseph in chapter 40 and verse 1. And it came to pass after these things that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was wroth against two of his officers, against the chief of the butlers and against the chief of the bakers, and he put them inward in the house of the captain of the guard, into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, and they continued a season in war. And they dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison. And Joseph came in unto them in the morning and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of the Lord's house, saying, Wherefore look ye so sadly today? And they said unto him, We have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. And the chief butler told his dream to Joseph, and said to him, In my dream, behold, a vine was before me, and in the vine there were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded. And her blossoms shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. And I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave them to the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said unto him, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head, and restore thee unto thy place, and thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand after the former manner, when thou wast his butler. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head. And in the uppermost basket there was of all manner of baked meats for Pharaoh, and the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. And Joseph answered and said, This is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. And it came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief butler unto his butlership again, and he gave the cup unto Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgat him. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed. And behold, he stood by the river. We're going to pause just there for a second. Think about it now. 2 years have gone by, and this butler has not yet brought to the attention of Pharaoh Joseph and his ability. Once again, it would seem as though Joseph is getting the short end of the stick. It would seem as though these initial dreams that Joseph had dreamed are just not coming unto pass. And so we see then in verse 2, And behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine and fat-fleshed, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kine upon the brink of the river. And the ill-favored and the lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat kine. So Pharaoh awoke, and he slept, and dreamed the 2nd time. And behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 thin ears, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day, Pharaoh was wroth with his servants, and put me in ward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream in one night, and we dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And there was there with us a young man, an Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dream he did interpret. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. And so Joseph then is going to be brought before Pharaoh, and by being brought before Pharaoh and interpreting the dream before Pharaoh regarding the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine, Joseph would eventually rise in Egypt and would become of great significance in his position under Pharaoh, and would eventually then be addressed and approached by his brethren, by the Hebrew people, looking for some type of relief in the midst of the 7 years of famine. And as Joseph then is interacting with his brethren, we notice here in chapter 45 that it is grieving him to be speaking before his brethren as they are before now Joseph, looking for help and aid in this time of famine. And Joseph then explains in verse 3 of chapter 45, I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live? And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. And Joseph said unto his brethren, Come near to me, I pray you. And they came near, and he said, I am Joseph your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. Now therefore be not grieved nor angry with yourselves that ye sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in the which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Verse 8, So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God, and he hath made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Folks, Joseph had multiple occasions and opportunities to abandon God, to fall in despair and say, you know what, the story is over. There's no point any longer to remaining faithful unto God. There's no point any longer in trusting in Him. But he refused to do so, and he remained faithful even in the midst of his difficulty, even in the midst of his mistreatment. And indeed, the dream came to pass, and Joseph was there, well positioned to aid his brethren, just as the initial dream had prophesied. Let's go to Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6. Notice with me here, Daniel and the lion's den. Daniel chapter 6. We notice here in verse 1, It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom. And over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, and the king should have no damage. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. Brethren, our attitude and our mindset and our faithfulness to God cannot be underemphasized. Daniel here, just as Joseph, is maintaining faithfulness in the midst of idolatry, in the midst of those who would seek to destroy him, in the midst of many opportunities to fall into despair. But he chooses instead an excellent spirit and a faithfulness to the Lord, and by doing so is esteemed and is exalted above all those who don't have the Lord by their side, who aren't working with God, who don't live by the understanding, if God be for us, who can be against us, as Paul will explain in Romans chapter 8. And so it's no figure that Daniel, just as Joseph had plenty of opportunities and indeed did, would rise. And so we then see in verse 4, as Daniel is indeed trying to be destroyed, that these presidents and these princes are seeking to find occasion against Daniel. And they're recognizing there's no way that they could ever find an error or a fault in him. And so they recognize the opportunity is going to be to find it against him concerning the law of his God. Verse 5. Maybe if we just make a law that says it's illegal to do what it is that Daniel is doing regarding his faithfulness to God, then we can finally catch him. And so indeed a royal decree is signed by King Darius. A decree, a law according to the Medes and Persians. In other words, it could not be altered. It had to be executed. And we see that when this is signed, when it is in effect, Daniel is recognizing this, doesn't change his habits or his behavior whatsoever. But he goes into his house, verse 10, and his windows being opened in his chamber towards Jerusalem, he kneels upon his knees 3 times a day, and he prays and gives thanks before his God as he did aforetime. In other words, as his habit was. He's not going to alter his behavior. And so these men then assemble. They find Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. And so they then delivered unto Darius. And Darius then is forced to cast Daniel into the lion's den. And we notice there in verse 18, then the king went into his palace and passed the night fasting. And neither was instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste unto the den of lions. Darius didn't want Daniel to be destroyed. Daniel did not want what the princes and presidents were wanting to come about upon Daniel to come upon him. And so he's hoping that he's been saved. Verse 20, he comes to the den, he cries with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. And the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lions? Then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. My God hath sent his angel, and hath shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me, for as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. Then was the king exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. Notice then in verse 25, then King Darius wrote unto all people, nations, and languages that dwelt in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and steadfast forever, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. Now just imagine that. Here's an idolater and an idolatrous king with an idolatrous kingdom, declaring unto them and recognizing and observing that the God of Daniel, the Hebrew God, the one true and only living God, indeed is just that and ought to be observed. Go with me now to Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2. And notice here in the sermon of Peter unto the Jewish people, notice with me, beginning in verse 22, Ye men of Israel, hear these words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man approved of God among you by miracles and wonders and signs which God did by him in the midst of you, as ye yourselves also know. Him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, ye have taken and by wicked hands have crucified and slain, whom God hath raised up, having loosed the pains of death, because it was not possible that he should be holden of it. For David speaketh concerning him, I foresaw the Lord always before my face, for he is on my right hand, that I should not be moved. Therefore did my heart rejoice, and my tongue was glad. Moreover also my flesh shall rest in hope, because thou wilt not leave my soul in hell or Hades, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. In other words, he wouldn't be in the grave long enough to even begin corrupting. Thou hast made known to me the ways of life. Thou shalt make me full of joy with thy countenance. Men and brethren, let me freely speak unto you of the patriarch David, which whom, by the way, they respected, they honored, they were aware of these scriptures, they knew that the Messiah was coming. And here Peter is explaining unto them, yes, those verses, David whom you honored, he's the one that spoke of this man who you have killed. The end there in verse 29, that he is both dead and buried, that is David, and his sepulchre is with us unto this day, just as he had prophesied. Verse 30, therefore being a prophet and knowing that God has sworn with an oath to him, that of the fruit of his loins, according to the flesh, he would raise up Christ to sit on his throne. He, seeing this before, spake of the resurrection of Christ, that his soul was not left in hell, or Hades, neither his flesh did see corruption. This Jesus hath God raised up, whereof we are all witnesses. Therefore, being by the right hand of God exalted, and having received of the Father the promise of the Holy Ghost, he hath shed forth this which ye now see and hear. For David is not ascended into the heavens, but he saith himself, the Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou on my right hand, until I make thy foes thy footstool. Therefore, let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God hath made that same Jesus, whom ye have crucified, both Lord and Christ. Yes, indeed, you thought you put an end to this, just as many times Joseph, it looked as though there was an end to it, just as the princes and the presidents regarding Daniel thought they put an end to it, so too the people of God, the Old Testament nation of God, thought they had put an end to Jesus by having him crucified on the cross. But that same Jesus, who they sought to silence, who they sought to kill and end, he was raised. He's alive. He's been resurrected. And folks, when we think about our Christian life, when we think about our walk with the Lord and our faithfulness to Him, when we think about maybe the persecution that comes upon us at work, the social pressures that maybe we feel and is pressed upon us by our friends, by our neighbors, by our coworkers, when we think about maybe the hard times, the challenges, the struggles, the trials of life, whether it be because of our finances, because of our health, maybe because of relationship issues that we have with other folks, when we feel like it's at the very end, let us take some time to think about Joseph. Take some time to think about Daniel. Take some time to think about Christ. Because He's explained to us, shown us by His resurrection, but likewise explained to us that we're going to have challenges, we're going to have tribulation. But be of good cheer, I have overcome the world. John chapter 16 and verse 33. Folks, in the very end, with God's people, yes, it may not work out the way we'd like it to in this world, but in the very end, we will have victory. Think to yourself the next time you're in the midst of that moment of despair. Think as if the movie was ending. What is part 2? What's going to happen next? Well, regardless of what happens to you physically, what will happen if you're faithful is that you will have an eternal home with God in heaven above. If you just overcome the world and not give up your faith in those moments. Brethren, we walk by faith and not by sight. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7. We don't walk based upon the context and the circumstances that surround us in this world. But we walk according to the Word of God, cleaving to the promises that He has provided us through His Son, Jesus Christ. Are you remaining faithful to those promises this evening, brother and sister? If not, if you need prayers of the congregation, if you need to be restored, if you need to come on home, we're here for you. If you've not yet become a Christian, not yet become a child of God, then you're not yet even striving to overcome the world. As Jesus explains there in John 16 verse 33, you are of the world. Don't be of the world any longer.